Nobody embraced excess like the Cabaret. Dance and music, friends, and Halo. Harnessed from their very own angel, the Cabaret had a seemingly endless supply of this distilled magic and used it to fuel their parties, their family, and their empire. But the most desirable substance in existence might not even have been their greatest draw. Though they would never admit it, some joined the Cabaret just for the food. And in charge of all the menus of Cabaret restaurants was Chef Rocco, whose culinary dominion spanned across all levels of New Capenna. The abundance of Halo only elevated their skills even more, and now Rocco's mastery of cuisine has manifested as a powerful asset for their family. In an entirely different part of the multiverse, one scared coward of a warrior stumbled from one misfortune into the next. Animated masonry, goblins, and saber-toothed tigers were only the beginning of his tragedy. Poor Norin got lost in one of Dominaria's dreaded time rifts and eventually found himself in the future, only to then draw the unluckiest straw and open a door to Duskmorn. He's now doomed to wander an ever-expanding eternal house of horror. But despite all his suffering, at the very least, Norin continues to survive. Hi friends, today I want to show you a deck that I ended up disassembling because it just kept winning. It made the game incredibly easy because it looks completely harmless until there's no stopping it anymore, all while having absolutely no combo lines. Now I understand that might not be the best pitch for a deck tech video, but this is a really unique deck that uses a bunch of interesting cards in a way that you might not be used to, so I thought you guys might appreciate it, even though you might not want to play it. But I do also think there are probably some freaks amongst you that might actually enjoy playing it as well. This is a deck tech for Rocco, Cabaret Caterer, but Rocco is only technically our commander. The card that our deck is really built around is Norin the Wary. Norin is an incredibly unique card that allows us to repeatedly trigger effects that depend on creatures entering the battlefield, while being nearly impossible to interact with. He allows us to fuel a never-ending value engine that provides us with card draw, board presence, burn damage, even ramp. And all of that on a €50 budget. The core plan of this deck is to ramp in the early game, bring some sort of synergy piece into play, and then summon Norin to get our engine started. Since Norin is the heart and soul of this deck, we're going to discuss him first and focus on lands, ramp, and more generic components later. This deck has two commanders. Rocco, Cabaret Caterer, is our actual commander and sits in the command zone. Rocco is a 3/1 elf druid that costs a red, a white, and a green mana, as well as optionally costing X additional mana. When Rocco enters the battlefield, if we cast them, then we get to search our deck for a creature with mana value X or less and put it directly onto the battlefield. 88.9% of the time, we're going to cast Rocco for X equals 1, and then we'll grab our secret commander, Norin the Wary, out of our deck. Norin is a 1-mana, 2/1 human warrior that's a bit of a coward. Whenever somebody plays a spell or a creature attacks, Norin immediately exiles himself and then returns under our control at the end step. This constant self-flickering effect is super interesting, but unfortunately, Norin is mono-red, and that is quite restrictive. But because of his ability, Norin is nearly impossible to destroy, which means we don't have to play him as our actual commander. As long as we can guarantee that we bring Norin into play at a reasonable time, then we can build around him even if he doesn't have the additional protection of being a commander. Rocco basically adds a 3-mana tax to Norin, but allows us to play with Cabaret colors, which gives us access to a much broader range of effects that synergize with Norin. So Rocco's main job is just to search out Norin, and afterwards we'll use them to block an attack or something, put them back into the command zone, and keep them ready for an emergency. Ideally, we want to do this as soon as we hit 4 mana, but sometimes it can be better to wait a bit longer. This depends a lot on which synergy pieces we are able to establish early. Norin is a 1 mana value, 2 power creature that leaves and enters the battlefield every single turn, including those of our opponents. This enables us to twist some of the most fair card draw effects in Commander into heuristic study level nonsense. Welcoming Vampire, Tokasia's Welcome, and Enduring Innocence each draw a card whenever a creature with power 2 or less or mana value 3 or less enters the battlefield under our control. Norin fulfills these conditions, so we draw a card whenever he enters. Each of these is limited to once per turn, and usually that would mean we draw 1 additional card per turn rotation. But Norin nearly always leaves and enters the battlefield on our opponent's turns as well, meaning we get to trigger these effects up to 4 times per turn rotation, which is absurdly powerful. After I played this deck against my friends a couple of times, they started treating these simple card draw effects as game-ending threats, since they would rapidly generate bizarre amounts of value. It's nice too that they only cost 3 mana to play, letting us curve into Norin to immediately start drawing cards. And in long games, we could even spend 8 mana to search them out with our second Rocco cast. These kinds of card draw effects are our highest priority pieces when we are looking for our mulligan. If we have one of them in hand, enough lands and maybe a piece of ramp, perfect. On top of the 3 I already mentioned, we also play Soul of the Harvest, Mentor of the Meek, Rumor Gatherer, Irreverent Gremlin, and Path of Discovery. Each of these is slightly worse, either requiring additional mana or not technically being card draw. But they still generate incredible value and will help us either fill up our hand or refine it so we have everything we need to keep the engine going. If you already own a Great Henge or a Guardian project, then you can also add those for some additional redundancy. As always, keep in mind when I make those more pricey suggestions, I do so under the assumption that you might already own those cards. I don't expect you to spend $30 on a Great Henge so you can play it in your silly little Norin deck. However, unfortunately, Tokasia's Welcome and Enduring Innocence are also a bit more pricey, and I do consider those 2 essential. They are, however, great additions to any collection as they can be played in a wide range of other decks. Now that we are drawing cards, we need to quickly turn our card advantage into a board presence, because otherwise we're gonna get attacked. Like a lot. We have 6 creatures that each grow whenever Norin enters, and that then carry additional powerful effects. These immediately become dangerous, since, because of Norin, they grow much quicker than they are supposed to. Particularly noteworthy here are the Gala Greeters, who can also optionally create treasure tokens to ramp us, or they can heal us for 2. These huge creatures are of course fantastic blockers, but they also tend to act as a once per turn removal spell, as we can just run them at our opponents and they'll be forced to block. On top of that, we play 4 cards that create token creatures whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield, which allows us to rapidly build a wide board that threatens quick kills. The standout here is Blessed Sanctuary, which not only creates powerful 2/2 tokens, but also protects us and our board from all non-combat damage, which is surprisingly often relevant. Norin generates both a tall and wide board with ease, which we primarily want to use defensively. While we can kill our opponents just by attacking them, from my experience, the best way to win is through burn. Cards like Impact Tremors and Warstorm Surge apply constant pressure whenever Norin enters, pinging our opponents for consistent damage. At first glance, this damage may seem minor, but because of how often Norin enters, and coupled with our additional token generation, this damage adds up incredibly quickly. If we then manage to stick one of our greedier cards, Torbran, Thane of Redfell, it's possible for us to burn out an entire table in just 1 or 2 turn rotations. Let's math this out a little bit. If we have a board of Saradok, Master of Buckland, Torbran and Impact Tremors, which is not unreasonable at all, then we deal 6 damage to each opponent at the end of each player's turn. 24 damage to each opponent in a single turn rotation. What's important here is that we are putting out this much pressure while generating a board and without spending any mana past the initial investment. We have to make no concessions and take no risks. If it comes to burn, there are also more expensive options available if you'd like to incorporate those. Perforos, God of the Forge, and Ajade Instigator would both significantly increase our damage output and make for powerful substitutions for Torbran. There's also War Leader's Call, which is certainly powerful as it burns and makes our tokens stronger, but I actually advise against it because it's an aura that would buff Norin and that could turn off some of our card draw. There are a couple of other cards that also work with Norin that I have excluded here, mostly because I think they're really mean, and so I advise against playing them, but you know. Here you go. Confusion in the Ranks and Aura Shards are both overwhelmingly powerful, as they turn any Norin trigger into effectively a removal spell. But honestly, that's not gonna be enjoyable for most casual tables, as our opponents just won't get to play anymore until they remove these enchantments. Mirror March would also allow us to create additional ETB triggers, because we get to create additional Norins. But it interrupts the flow of play too much, as it takes a lot of time to flip at least one coin at the end of every single turn. So you could add those cards, but I don't really think you should. It's also not great from a strategic perspective. We don't want to draw too much attention in the early game. Once we have a value engine set up, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop us. But if our opponents just start murdering everything we play before we get the chance to set up Norin, well, then things can be difficult. A bit of a warning on that end: if you play this deck too often, people will start murdering everything you play. I already touched on this a bit with Mirror March. The only thing better than one Norin is two. Sword Skitter is a card very similar to Norin, as it's a creature that immediately flickers itself when another creature comes into play. We can stack this with Norin in such a way that Sword Skitter basically never exists. When we first play it, we have to wait until the end of turn for Norin to come back, at which point it exiles itself. But then at the end of the next turn, we get both the Sword Skitter and Norin return effects on the stack. We order these so that the Sword Skitter enters first and Norin second. That way, the Sword Skitter immediately exiles itself again. Once accomplished, we can safely double up on many of our engine effects. Path of Discovery, Soul of the Harvest, and Rumor Gatherer become especially effective here, and Sword Skitter also works better with Warstorm Surge, letting us Lightning Bolt whenever something comes into play. But we can push this even further. Panharmonicon doubles all of our ETBs, and Gandalf the White those of Norin. Double the tokens, double the pings, and also double the value from our next and last batch of Norin synergy. We play Soul Warden and Essence Warden to gain, I guess, infinity life. One time I was playing against my friends and they legitimately dealt over 200 damage to me before they finally got the kill. If you are a life gain enjoyer and have a Souls Attendant, then that's a reasonable addition to complete the trial. I've excluded it here though because I don't think a third of these effects is necessary and it's slightly more expensive. On that note, Panharmonicon and Gandalf are also a bit more pricey. I think Panharmonicon is a safe purchase as it works in a wide range of decks, but Gandalf is a bit more specific. I just think he's neat, and we already play a bunch of Lord of the Rings cards, so he fits in with those. But if you want to replace him, then go right ahead. Put in a secret rendezvous instead, so we can commit some crimes with it. We are nearing the end of our Norin synergies. Rose Room Treasurer generates treasure tokens when other creatures enter. Heron Blade Elite becomes an enormous mana dog that can also swing for damage. Samwise Gamgee creates infinity food, and since we play a significant amount of legendary creatures, Sam can return those to our hand from our graveyard. And finally, probably the most powerful card in our deck is Kodama of the East Tree, which lets us put a permanent with equal or lesser mana cost directly into play from our hand whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under our control, so long as that first permanent didn't come into play through Kodama. This means we get a land drop every time Norin enters. A land! Keep in mind that we're regularly drawing at least 4 cards per turn rotation, and it's not unusual for there to be 8 or even 12. With Kodama, we can then slam all of those extra lands in our hand directly into play. Setting aside Norin synergy, Kodama also lets us cheat out many of the other powerful permanents in our deck. For example, we can play Angelic Sellsword and then use the Kodama trigger to also put down Saradoc, Master of Buckland. But of course, we also play Soul Skitter. Soul Skitter enters and costs 4 mana. So now Saradoc becomes free. Any permanent in our deck with a mana value of 4 or less becomes free. Even just a single rotation with Kodama in play will frequently give us a game-winning advantage. On last Friday's community stream, somebody played an over-the-top against me when I had Kodama in play, which resulted in immediate death for the entire table as it turned into an unstoppable barrage of triggers. To make sure we have enough mana for all of these shenanigans, we play 11 pieces of fairly generic ramp. Rampant Growth, Talismans, Cultivate and Kodama's Reach. The usual. I opted for a high amount of artifact-based ramp here because they work nicely with Kodama and Sam and they are slightly more affordable. But if you would like to substitute this for more land-based ramp, then more power to you. I generally prefer land-based ramp as it's more resilient to board vibes. The one uncommon piece of engine ramp that we play is Freeze Strider Lookout, which is a creature that, once a turn, when we commit a crime, lets us look at the top 5 cards of our deck and put a land from among them into play. This brings us to my favorite silly interaction in the deck, which requires Outpost Siege, or Warstorm Surge, but Outpost Siege is way funnier. Outpost Siege, of course, has 2 modes. The good one that lets us impulse draw on each of our turns, and then the bad one that I wasn't even sure what it did before I started syntax searching Scryfall while building this deck. It makes it so that whenever a creature we control leaves the battlefield, we get to ping any target for 1 damage, which is illegal. Whenever Norin leaves, we get to commit a crime, which triggers a Freeze Strider Lookout up to 4 times per turn rotation. Is this good? Probably not. Is this very funny and an interaction you never get to see? Absolutely. And so, in it goes. But that's not our only criminal behavior. The worst thing that can happen to us is if our opponents play a permanent that can somehow deal with Norin. For example, Containment Priest would stop Norin from entering, cards with Split Second would prevent his trigger, and permanents that have activated abilities that can deal targeted damage can even kill Norin. These are few and far between. There aren't many cards that can take down our Slippery Boy, and even less actually see play. But we need to be ready for the possibility, because if we ever lose Norin, our deck falls apart, which is why we play quite a lot of instant speed removal. Cards like Generous Gift, Chaos Warp and Beast Within each serve double duty by getting rid of the problematic permanent while triggering Norin so he can escape if he ever gets successfully targeted. They're obviously also helpful for anything that might kill us, which would be bad. On top of the single target removal, we also play 3 board vibes in Austere Command, Dusk Dawn and Blasphemous Act. In total, this list has 11 pieces of removal, but you should always play a distribution of removal and RAS that your local community is comfortable with. If it turns out that this is too much, then you can instead opt for more protection, as adding other instants is always a viable option, especially if you can find ones that cycle, like Shelter and Reprieve. This is also a way you can push the budget and power level of the deck by including cards like Teferi's Protection and Heroic Intervention. You can make space for those additional cards by getting rid of the Freeze Strider Lookout and Outpost Siege combo. I also currently play a set of additional utilities that you can feel free to substitute with your own preferred cards. But here are explanations for mine. Wall of Omens and Blossoms to deter early attacks, Endra's Forerunners to turn our tokens into dead opponents, and Skullbinder because giving our opponents a helping hand is a crime. And that's funny. These also work great with Panharmonicon. Finally, I like playing Fog to catch a fool off guard. Oh, and if you added Secret Rendezvous, always keep in mind that according to the rules of Magic, two girls kissing is a crime. Be gay, do crimes, ramp with Free Strider Lookout. I don't have much to say about our mana base, as it's simply a standard budget 3-color mana base. Play whatever you have access to. I'm particularly fond of the bounce lands as they work great with Kodama, and I also like Sheltering Landscape, which is a fantastic color fixer. The biggest weakness of this deck is that whenever Norin is successfully removed, then the rest of the deck just becomes very mid. We need to always have a spell ready for when we think there might be a possibility of somebody successfully interacting with Norin. This doesn't happen frequently, so spotting those opportunities and then responding to them is the main skill required to play this deck. Because other than that, this plays itself. We don't have to do anything once an engine is set up, and the entire deck consists of engines. Everything flows into each other and quickly builds up board states that are so overwhelming that it forces our opponents into board wiping. But the board wipes never hit Norin, meaning we can just immediately rebuild and often much quicker than our opponents. This deck is incredibly consistent and difficult to interrupt, but that consistency also goes the other way. There aren't many upgrades we can make to it. I already mentioned a handful, and we can add Preston the Vanisher and Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, to that list. But other than that, there isn't much else. We would have to start adding generic good stuff cards, and whenever I find myself at that spot, I would rather build a different deck. I spoiled it at the beginning, but I actually ended up disassembling this deck because it was just too easy to win with. My opponents often had no idea what I was up to, and by the time they realized it, it was already too late, as I had built too much of an advantage. On top of that, the deck mostly plays itself. All I had to do was keep track of the machine, and then eventually turn it sideways, or start counting down my opponent's life totals. Norin just can't be interacted with, and that made the deck frustrating for my opponents to play against, which is something that I personally care a lot about and try to prevent. However, that's not to say that this deck isn't enjoyable. It's very unique, and there's a certain part of my brain that gets very happy when I get to trigger once per turn effects on every turn. I also like that we get to play a bunch of cards that we wouldn't usually see in other places, like Gimli and Legolas. As I already mentioned, this deck has a budget of around 50 euros, although ordering all of the cards off of Card Market will run you around 75 because of shipping. Would I recommend this deck? Weirdly? Yeah, it's really unique. I don't think it's something I would make a permanent deck. I would just buy a bunch of the cards that I know I can use for my collection and then proxy the rest of the very specific ones, play it for a couple of rounds, and then disassemble it again. But it is a unique experience, and Norin is just a very cool card. I just really like Norin. So I think overall, this is a deck that I would recommend that you play for a little bit and then take apart again. I mean, that's what I did as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. I would definitely appreciate that. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel here, and don't forget to join our Friday streams. Now, we have currently been trying to upload one video a week, although limited success, but we are trying. Unfortunately, the next video will take a little bit longer because it is a larger project. It is the complete design history of Commander. Yes, I've gone and researched the complete development history of Commander. It's 7,500 words. It's probably going to be around an hour long. It's gonna take a little bit, sorry. But I think it's a really cool video. It'll take a moment until it's done. I just needed to know how Commander, like what its history was, I guess. I needed to figure out how it all went down because I wasn't there for it. and I felt like it would be good for me to know. And I think you guys are going to enjoy that video as well. So you can anticipate that, although as I said, it might take 2 weeks instead of the usual 1 week. Alright then, I'll see you then.